Catherine Batchelor, Peter Freeman, Tom Fish. Very warm welcome to the Digital Markets Research Hub. I'm very glad that we have an opportunity to discuss quite a few issues related to this paradigmatic reform, which we embarked upon a few years ago, and it looks that we are approaching to its successful legislative end, and the new regime of enforcement competition policy in digital markets will start in 2024, hopefully. There were a few issues which attracted particular attention of all stakeholders and broader societal cycles. So I hope we will revert to some of them. And one of the latest and probably one of the most fundamental existential matters which concern many participants in this new regime is the level of judicial scrutiny. And Peter, it would be very difficult to find a person who would be more competent and more experienced than you are. So it's great that we can ask you this question just as a matter of reminding to the listeners, to all of us, and maybe explanation of some background. What is at stake? What's the difference between JR and full merits review, please?
Well, thank you, Oles, and thank you for the kind words. I think experience, I wouldn't claim competence. And I must make it clear, I'm speaking for myself. I don't speak for the Competition Appeal Tribunal in any of this. I advise them, but I don't chair cases anymore. The standard of review ought to be a distraction in this exercise. I think I want to make it clear, we all want this regime to work. We want it to be effective. It is necessary. It's needed. It's filling an important gap. And I don't think there should be any attempt to derail this through an argument about whether there should be higher appeal standard or lower appeal standard. So I'm firmly in the camp of the people who want this regime to work, to be well designed and well applied. Now, in answer to your question, I mean, judicial review is the way in which markets, mergers are reviewed by the courts. And it essentially looks at the fairness, the rationality, and the legality of the decision under review. Merits review goes one stage further and allows the tribunal to look at the merits of the case, whether the decision is in its view wrong or right. And if it thinks it's wrong, it can substitute its own decision for the view of the regulator, the authority. So, I mean, that's the essential difference. There are various practical spin-offs from that. The examination of evidence, obviously, in merits case tends to be more protracted, heavier, get more witnesses, that sort of thing. And also the key difference, I think, is that the court can substitute its own decision and doesn't have to send the case back to the regulator to re-examine, which is the traditional remedy for judicial review. I mean, that's the difference. Both are long and detailed. I noticed Sarah Cardell's evidence to the select committee the other day saying she thought judicial review was very long and very detailed. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of slightly misguided talk about it. Judicial review is not necessarily light touch. It can be very intensive, but that's the essential difference.
And as a follow-on question, Peter, can you explain to us also what is the standard of review for other competition policy associated areas?
Do you mean in the UK? I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, as I've said, for markets and mergers, the CAT reviews these on a judicial review standard. That is, I think, because partly the regime was inherited from the old Competition Commission OFT regime, where there had already been one layer of commission type examination, and it was thought that judicial review was a sufficient judicial scrutiny level on top of that. In telecommunications, which is the other main area where there tend to be appeals, there is now judicial review, but it's popularly called Judicial Review Plus because somebody left the EU law that required consideration of the merits still in force. So we have a sort of a hybrid regime. The CMA itself looks at regulatory appeals under various guises in a way that actually does look quite like a merits appeal, but it's very difficult to compare these regimes because they operate in slightly different ways. Nobody would pretend that the UK system is perfect, coherent, clean, easy to understand. Trying to explain it to somebody who's not familiar with it is a nightmare because everything is different, and every time government has attempted to reform regulatory appeals, it has found it too difficult. And I think that's where it stands at the moment.
Thank you very much. And I must note that in two of your recent publications, one Judge Douglas Ginsburg and another by Professor Barry Roger, you are very clear and very scrupulous in examining all these details. So it's hard to, it's really important to recommend this text for people who are interested in scrutinizing the further details. Let me now revert to you, Tom. You've been working at the CMA, and now you work at an undertaking which would be one of many beneficiaries from the new regime, where the markets will be where we will provide some societal regulatory energy to those systemically entrenched markets in order to challenge this steeped situation, which appears to be the only means which is left in our toolkit, regulatory toolkit. Can you explain what is at stake with this DMCC bill? What specific issues are, in your view, of particular importance, and how these issues will be mitigated or solved with help of the new regime?
Thanks. Yeah, happy to. I think my experience from being at the CMA and now as a sort of a challenger startup firm, I think they enable me perhaps to sort of step back a bit from some of the sort of the legal and academic debates, which I think are incredibly important, and it's right that they are had as the bill has been formed. But I think from my perspective, it's also really important to consider what will be the real world implications of this particular provision in the Act. What if we made a drafting change rather than thinking about the sort of the academic arguments around that? I try to think, okay, what will be the actual outcomes for my business, for my market, for the other participants that we're engaged with. And I tend to sort of think about it along a spectrum, where at one end of the spectrum there is a bold, confident, empowered CMA that's acting decisively to sort of transform the market, and at the other sort of extreme end of the spectrum there's sort of timid, nervous CMA that perhaps doesn't know the full boundaries of its powers, and perhaps is sort of nervous of taking on the most contentious cases. And I think there are a few aspects of the bill that, if you change them, you could move in different directions along the spectrum in terms of the outcomes that are achieved. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that the appeals standard debate necessarily is about these extreme outcomes, but I do believe that by introducing a wider range of grounds for potential appeals, you naturally result, I think, in a higher number of appeals and probably a higher number of CMA decisions that are overturned. And I think ultimately that will just that will feed into CMA decision making. It could lead to some additional level of caution, some nervousness around being embarrassed by some high profile losses, and ultimately, just for companies like Generate, that's bad news. That signals a slightly less interventionist CMA, perhaps a less effective regime, and slightly less enforcement. And it's for those sort of practical reasons that we're sort of pushing against any amendment to this aspect of the bill.
And did you also participated in several oral hearings in both houses of Parliament. So, what's your sense of non-verbal, the feelings about because the verbal part of the story we can watch due to this opportunity to all the hearings being available online, which is a great treasure for all researchers, etc. But beyond this, what's your feeling? Do you think the critical mass of, or there is kind of emerging consensus to one direction or another? Is it moving? What's your feeling about this, Tom?
I perhaps wouldn't want to sort of do too much crystal ball gazing. I think almost everyone I speak to about the topic seems to agree that the JR standard in the bill as it's currently drafted is about right. There are some exceptions, notably a handful of companies and some of the advisory firms that they employ. But yeah, I think there seems to be an expectation that there might be an amendment on its way. At least there's a desire from Downing Street to make some sort of change, and we hope that the messages from right across the economy and right across the various sectors affected will have landed over the last few weeks.
Let me now move to you, Catherine. You work at the CMA and more specifically the Digital Markets Unit, and you were among the main voices of the CMA when the reform itself was discussed. The very idea about the reform, the trajectory, and main pillars or main elements of the reform. So, how would you see this current challenge in terms of the standard of judicial scrutiny through the lens of the enforceability of the new regime from the CMA perspective?
Thank you. Yeah, funnily enough, it was Tom and I both worked on the task force, so both of us were there at the origins of thinking about this regime. I mean, my view remains the same view I held when we did the task force, which is that judicial review remains the right standard. And our view in the CMA is that provides for timely, effective and robust scrutiny of our decisions. And as Peter rightly said, judicial review is not a light touch appeal standard. It's not a sort of cursory check. It is a detailed check, not only of our procedures, but also of our analytical approach and the evolution of the evidence. So, but I think the crucial thing is judicial review takes our final decision as the starting point. Whereas in a full merits case, the concern is that the parties themselves can seek to turn this into a sort of rehearing of the entire case. And that has several important implications. And for us, the main ones are, firstly, that it turns the regime into an overly adversarial one. So that parties seek, every element of the case is contested. And that whereas, we've talked about this participative approach that we very much, want to make work, we think that's the right approach, it's likely to be more effective. Parties won't seek to engage in that participative approach, but rather will contest every element of the regime until they get to that sort of final appeal. So it takes away those incentives to potentially engage earlier in resolving issues and trying to provide for timely outcomes. And as we've talked about in this regime, timely outcomes are really, really important, where you can be in a situation where, the change of an algorithm can put a firm out of business overnight. You need to be able to resolve these things quickly. So the length of time it takes to resolve these appeals is also a key factor. And when you're doing a rehearing of the entire case, I take Peter's point. I don't think either are short, but I think judicial review is on the whole likely to be shorter than full merits, taking into account the fact that the likelihood that parties are contesting not only that appeal, but also, as I say, being more adversarial in all elements of the case, even that administrative early phase. So our concern is that we would rather keep the judicial review standard, because, as I say, our view is that that provides for robust, timely, effective scrutiny of our decisions, and I think that timely element is the really key one.
And obviously, do do you think that with such increase in terms of standard of judicial scrutiny, the CMA would become more risk averse, because this is one of the kind of possible hypothetical implications? Would it somehow behaviorally nudge you to be more selective with picking up, or with doing this pro-competition creative process of opening up digital markets?
So I think for me, it's not a question of risk appetite. It's actually a question of just pure resourcing. So I think, I mean, you can look at other regimes where we have full merits, and I wouldn't say we were necessarily timid in those regimes if you look at some of the cases. But I think the bottom line is, when you have a full merits appeal standard, we've talked about this element of all elements of the case take longer. And that means the CMA can tackle less issues at one time. So that means, by definition, we're not going to have more resources. We still have the same amount of resources. So it does mean that we can't tackle as many issues as we could if we were able to resolve things quicker. So I see it perhaps not positioned quite as risk appetite, but just more about how much we can do with the resources we have. And when things take longer, we have to do less.
Well, Liz, could I just...
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, Peter, please.
I understand perfectly where Catherine's coming from, because we've been through a very similar debate in relation to full merits appeals in antitrust. But I must just correct one point. I don't think this is ever going to be a rehearing, a complete rehearing of the CMA's work. That point has been dealt with, I think, in the antitrust context. The appeal, even on the merits, is limited to the grounds of appeal, and the starting point for the assessment is the authority's decision. We're very clear about that. It's not as if the tribunal or the courts sit back and say, oh, here's an interesting case on XYZ. Let's see what we think about it. It doesn't work like that at all. It is a question of how the decision is scrutinized. It's not a question of roaming far and wide over the territory. So I think, don't want to overcharacterize the problem, I think.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I think my point was more, that's what the parties seek to try and get out of it.
I think we'll come on to this. I think the parties will seek to do quite a lot anyway, so we're going to have to deal with that in one way or another.
Okay, let me pick on this point. I think it's because it appears to be a quite important one. Let me put it in my mouth, because I'm a neutral observer. So when we talk about the traditional ex post competition policy, we know that the standard, the CMA, the decisions of the CMA or any competition enforcers must be, robust and reliable, not only from the perspective of, and I cite you, Peter, here, standard of judicial review, illegality, irrationality, procedural impropriety, and proportionality, but also in terms of the substance of the case. With this new regime, where the whole ethos was somehow to grant discretionary power to the enforcers, it's kind of regulatory experiments, regulatory sandbox. We don't know axiomatic answer to these conundrums, and it's learning by doing somehow the modality, which is completely unknown territory, and there is no current, and the standard of proof itself would be very hard for CMA to substitute with robust evidence on economic analysis or some previous case law. Do you think that this new regime deserves this kind of level of discretion for the enforcer? Let's somehow say, by channeling the message, okay, try to do it for a couple of years. We will see where it will lead us politically in terms of what we as society wants to achieve. And then after a while, we could somehow tighten it up a little bit and increase the standard. Would this vision be a little bit too frivolous, against the rule of law ethos or something like this, in your view, Peter?
Quite sure what you're suggesting. I mean, I'm a great believer in getting these regimes right from the start, and then doing the utmost to make them work effectively. And I think we have to recognize that I wouldn't say this is unfair, but the odds are stacked quite heavily against the authorities in these cases, and they have a lot of work to do, because they are dealing with very well-resourced companies by definition. These are large companies. The regime is self-selecting. And I don't think giving it a try and then changing the standard of review is really very sensible in this. I think let's get it settled in the statute, and then everybody should turn their hands to the wheel and try and make it work effectively.
Okay, let me ask you, Catherine, and you, Tom, if you want to comment on this part.
I mean, I don't think for a minute we think that what we'll be doing in the first couple of years of the regime is experimenting. The regime is grounded in the need for evidence-based judgment. So if you think about the SMS investigation, it's an evidence-based assessment as to whether the firm has substantial entrenched market power and a position of strategic significance. So we'll be making that assessment on the basis of the evidence that we have in front of us. And similarly, when it comes to putting in place conduct requirements, you know, they're not going to be plucked out of thin air, or we'll give this a try and see what the firms make of it and then review it. The conduct requirements will be, again, grounded in the evidence we see, the problems we see, the potential problems we see, and the need for those conduct requirements. And, you know, we have a number of elements that we need to think about in terms of imposing them. So the extent to which they're proportionate. We certainly wouldn't be imposing something and thinking, oh, we'll give this a try, you know, impose huge cost on firms in implementing those conduct requirements, and then in 3 years' time say, oh, it didn't work, we'll try something else. I think, you know, we will do our absolute due diligence to be absolutely confident in the requirements that we're putting forward at the point we impose them. But evidently we will be keeping them under review, and to the extent we do have to make tweaks here and there, of course we will. We'll make sure that they're fit for purpose. But I certainly, you know, would not for a minute think of the way that we'll be operating the regime in the early years as being experimental.
It reminds me the situation with Australia, the media bargaining code, where the original plan of ACCC was to designate two largest platforms as requiring to comply with the code. But before the designation process, the new amendment to the law has been introduced, somehow channeling the message to both companies that if you would be ready to enter into this commercial deals with publishers, you will not be designated as contributors to societal kind of to greater good of society. And both companies have entered into the deal. So it's kind of behavioral technique. Rather than being designated, they have agreed to cooperate voluntarily. So and this connects me to the issue of regulatory dialogue or participatory approach, Catherine, which you mentioned. So do I understand correctly that this the JR level of judicial scrutiny would give you more opportunities to communicate with companies on much less formal basis and try to fine-tune nitty-gritties of conduct requirements in much less kind of procedurally laborious fashion, leading to kind of goal-oriented rather than to process-oriented result. Whereas when you have full merits review, they will not be interested in such dialogue, and they will say, okay, I'll see you in court.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have, we've talked about the participative approach many times at the CMA, and we see that very much as the ensuring that we conduct the implementation and the operation of the digital markets regime in a participative manner, engaging with a wide variety of stakeholders. And that comes down to sort of engagement more generally on the issues that are sort of happening in the market, formal consultation, for example, in designation. There are requirements in the bill for us to formally consult stakeholders during an SMS investigation, but also in relation into conduct requirements. But also, I think, crucially, when it comes to thinking about compliance and the steps that a firm has taken in order to comply and the extent to which we think those are sufficient to meet the conduct requirement that we've set. But then again, also in terms of the kind of informal resolution of disputes. So, I mean, that is a key element of the regime. And clearly we will try and make that work, whichever standard of review that we end up with. But our view is that, as you say, firms are likely to have fewer incentives to engage in that participative approach, particularly the designated firms. if we are in a full merits appeal standard, because as you say, the expectation is that it creates more incentives for them to be adversarial along all elements of the regime. They will have far less incentives to try and resolve something informally or at an early stage with us, if they think that there is that full merits appeal down the road, and they can continue doing what they want until they get to that point, and then chance it in front of the cat. So yeah, our view is we would like to make that a participative approach work in either scenario, but we think there is more likelihood the firms will engage in a fuller extent under a judicial review standard.
Tom, and how do you see this problem? Or maybe if you can try to visualize, let's say, the part one of the bill, which is the only one. It's really amazing that the bill addresses many other topics which are completely irrelevant, or rather much less relevant to competition law cluster, but we talk only about part one of the bill. So what would be the difference in terms of JR and full merits review, in terms of which aspects of part one of the bill of the act would be justiciable?
Are you saying sort of which parts of the bill do I think sort of
you could challenge at the Competition Appeal Tribunal?
I suspect almost every decision will be appealed by a subset of the companies, and other companies will look to sort of join in with the participative approach from the start. I think that will be reflective of the approaches that sort of have been set over the last few years, probably. And yeah, I think probably from the outset, for a couple of the firms at least, we're likely to see almost every decision that the CMA tries to make appealed to, I guess, find the boundaries of the system and work out sort of where they can find ways to delay or influence the outcomes. I think I would just reflecting on what Kat said about the participative approach. I think Kat will know I've always been a sort of strong advocate for that being a necessary component of how the regime operates. That's a feeling that's been really cemented ever since I went from the CMA to Generate, where I think I've really discovered that a sort of stakeholder might tell the CMA they're suffering from a particular problem, whether that's something about being buried in search results or having problems with App Store review. But when you sort of get into the nitty gritty of it, there's actually, it might sound like one or two problems to the CMA, but to the company involved, there's potentially 30, 40 different complaints that they could raise within the course of 6 months. They're all slightly different and all probably separate potential breaches of conduct requirements that might come into force. So the volume of issues and concerns that are likely to be raised are, I believe, far greater than anyone could potentially contemplate. And I think as a result of that, it won't be practical to try and address all of those issues and concerns through quite formal, rigid enforcement procedures. And there's going to need to be a sort of less formal, slightly more agile approach in order to scratch the surface of these issues. So I think that means getting people in the room and talking to each other, clearing up misunderstandings, and try and sort of wipe out sort of low-hanging fruit through means other than long, laborious investigations. So that for me means for the regime to have a really significant impact, then sort of making that participative approach work is critical. So I was disappointed that there's no reference to that within the bill, but I think that just places perhaps more onus on the CMA to set out its intentions in that regard, perhaps in guidance or subsequent actions.
Peter, we often hear in conjunction with the argument that full merits review is not the most suitable one for the DMCC, that time is at issue and the digital year lasts for 3 months and everything is so quickly changing, and all these potential newcomers after long-term processes will not be even interested, or not even will lose this momentum, so to say. Can you elaborate on this point? How time-consuming is full merits review? What would be the strategic games for delay? And I said, what would be the role of the strategic games for delay and vexatious elements in your view from observing other areas of competition policy?
Yeah, just a quick word on incentives to litigate. I mean, there's another aspect to this, which is I'd quite take what Tom and Catherine are saying about how the authority feels about what the parties might do, and the parties feeling that they have a better chance in front of the tribunal than they have before the authority, and that making the system unworkable. I'm very familiar with that argument, and I'm very sympathetic to it. But it has been the case, in cases I've been concerned in, that the full merits appeal ends up with the authority winning. And if that happens consistently and the reasons for that become clear, then the incentive goes the other way, and the party doesn't have an incentive. The only benefit it would get is delay. And I agree there is an issue of delay, but full merits doesn't mean the authority loses. Full merits just means that the authority's arguments are considered in a slightly different way. So just make that point clear. Now, yes, merits appeals take a little longer. Courts can be quite flexible, but there is a sort of irreducible minimum that you can't get below. And I think CMA rightly takes the view in other contexts that they have to do quite a lot of work as well. And so they're getting their arguments together takes time. I think we're conscious of that, but that's a fairly sort of binary question. Do you have judicial control or not? You could perfectly well have a system under which you don't have judicial control. And indeed, I practiced for many years under a system where that was more or less the case. The minister decided what was right and what was wrong. Rightly or wrongly, we took a principled decision 20 years ago that the executive would step back, enforcement would be delegated to arm's length expert bodies like the CMA, like the DMU, and the accountability would be to some extent to the court of public opinion, but mainly through the courts. So, I mean, that's the system we have, and it's down to all of us to try and make it work. I think the shortest judicial review case the CAT ever had was 11 days. That was to do with Lloyd's TSB. It can be done. The rules are very flexible. But yeah, if you're going to have an argument in front of an independent tribunal, it's going to take a little time. Nothing much you can do about that. Question is it the most efficient, and is it clear, and does it send clear signals which can then be interpreted and relied on to affect future decisions?
Catherine, then the question is to you. We obviously observed the development with the DMCC, trying to compare it with the DMA, and one of the main differences is the complete absence of any instances of efficiency defense or contravening benefits exemption in the DMA, and the presence of quite generous, if you interpret it properly, provision of section 29, which requires imperatively the CMA to accept contravening benefits exemption. Would it, if it's JR standard, would it be even justiciable could it be appealed to the Competition Appeal Tribunal? And if it's full merits review, would it change the approach of the CMA to the presence of section, or at least to the wording of section 29?
So when you talk about section 29, clearly we're talking about the countervailing benefits exemption in relation to conduct requirements. And what that means is that the CMA can consider if a firm has breached a conduct requirement, the CMA can consider not taking that case forward because the reason the firm has breached the conduct requirement, the conduct that they're pursuing has some countervailing benefits. And we think it's right that countervailing benefits exemption is in there. Again, that was something that we recommended in the task force. But we think that the standard that is set out in the bill is an appropriately high standard. There are 4 limbs to that test, and it only allows the CMA to consider if there has been a countervailing benefit. One of those limbs is that the conduct the firm is pursuing is indispensable, so you can't achieve that benefit any other way. So we think that is a sufficiently high test. I assume the firm can appeal if we have failed to consider that exemption, failed to consider the evidence that the firm provided that a countervailing benefit had been, that there was a countervailing benefit. I'm sure the firm could appeal. If the method the court would apply when looking at that review will depend on whether it's a judicial review or a full merit standard.
Well, can I just say, I think this is an example where probably it makes no difference what the standard of review is, because we're looking at the considerations governing the consideration. So you would be looking at what the authority had done. You do that under JR, you do it under merits. So, I mean, this is very similar to 1013, as I call it. It's. I think people are familiar with looking at whether conditions for an exemption have been fulfilled, and the court would simply look at the way the authority had reasoned it. It's not really, doesn't go to the merits very much.
Even under full merits review?
I think so, because again, I should have said this earlier, the tribunal is also very careful and very respectful of what it calls judgment calls made by the authority. So it has to be really convinced it's a wrong decision before it overturns it, if it's a matter of the expert judgment by the authority. And this is actually one of those instances, I think. So I would not think standard review makes much difference here. Up to the authority to set out its reasons, and for those reasons to stack up.
That's in terms of the final implications, but how much time would it take, and would they receive the interim relief, for example, in your view, Peter?
I don't think this would be something that would take up much time. It could be done on reading the decision and seeing whether it made sense.
Tom, what is your view? How suitable the countervailing benefits exemption mechanism is for the bill? I know you were quite content with the presence of indispensability, raising the standard, placing the DMU in a quite secure position. Do you think the indispensability would suffice for making the argument very difficult for the designated undertakings?
Yeah, I hadn't recalled that we had recommended that in the task force. So the good news is I've reached the same conclusion a second time around. So I feel reassured by that. Yeah, I think a couple of reflections. Firstly, I've heard some quite sort of extreme arguments at sort of either end of the spectrum that the mere inclusion of the countervailing benefits exemption makes the bill completely useless and a waste of time. And at the other end of the spectrum, that the language in it is so strong and sets such a high bar that it's a complete waste of time having it in there. I think the fact that you've got these two extremes either side suggests it's somewhere in the middle, and it probably is somewhere quite sensible. I think from my personal experience of trying to get to grips with some of the arguments that the platforms put forward in relation to security and privacy and online safety, they are extremely challenging to disprove. Even over the course of a year, with sort of very strong information gathering powers, with the ability to bring in external advice, it can be quite challenging to sort of prove in a sort of black and white way that the arguments being put forward are clearly false, because the goalposts can keep moving. There's sometimes some subjectivity involved. Experts can disagree with one another, and I think all of the information and evidence that's required to reach the decision is in the hands of the platform themselves, and it can be incredibly difficult for the authority to get all of that necessary information to prove what's necessary. So I think what I'm trying to get around to saying is, I think it's essential that the burden of proof is on the platform to demonstrate that essentially, if they're going to break these legally binding rules consciously and knowingly, then they better have a good reason for doing it. So from my perspective, it's right that there is a high bar in the drafting of the bill, because they're sort of consciously breaking the rules and they think they've got a good reason for doing it. So it's on them to prove it.
If you look at the discussions at on the DMA, obviously it's a different legal entity and political entity as well. But the Commission was very vigilant and very vocal, trying to immunize the DMA from any instance of efficiency defense. Wouldn't the very function of the CMA be, and the efficient allocation of resources be more channeled and focused on delivering on this new pro-competition regime, if you wouldn't have to engage in this continuous never-ending ping pong with the SMSs in terms of justifying and explaining in very robust and solid terms the reliability of your decisions, Catherine?
I mean, I think it's really difficult to compare, because in the DMA you have a set of obligations which clearly a decision has been made that under no circumstances could you argue a countervailing benefit from those obligations. In our regime, we're being given discretion to set the obligations. And so, you know, government and parliament is giving the CMA that discretion with, you know, and because we have that discretion, you have to have I think you have to have a series of safeguards in place to control for that discretion. And I think countervailing benefits is one of them. You know, there have to be some checks and balances in, you know, the sort of conduct requirements that we could set. And I think countervailing benefits is one of them. And I think, you know, to follow up on some of Tom's points, you know, it's not just, oh, well, the firm's claimed a countervailing benefit, so the investigation goes out the window. It's a 4-limb test. You know, there's countervailing benefits. Those benefits outweigh any detrimental impact on competition. You can't achieve those benefits any other way. You know, they are indispensable. The conduct is indispensable to the realization of those benefits. You can see I've got the bill in front of me, and the conduct does not eliminate or prevent effective competition. So in my view, I think the countervailing benefits is a safeguard to, you know, in recognition of the fact that with the CMA is being given this discretion. But as Tom says, the important thing is that the bar is set in the right place. And I think our view is that it is in the bill.
And I would add to that a further reflection, really, which is the CMA, like all government organisations, thinks about policy by thinking about the full range of costs and benefits of intervening. I don't think the CMA would be sort of taking these kind of decisions very narrowly and in a sort of bubble, not thinking about the sort of broader implications. The CMA wouldn't think, for example, about intervening in the market for app distribution without thinking about the full range of potential consequences for consumers, whether that's around prices or security or privacy or anything else. So I think in truth, it's a bit moot, really, because the CMA will already have factored in the full range of potential implications of its interventions before getting to that point, in my opinion. So I suspect the question will already have been considered before the sort of you get to that staging.
Peter, I have a question about the private enforcement of the new regime. But before this, I wanted just to finish with this aspect. Catherine, maybe you can explain. We don't have intervening benefits exemptions for Chapter 4 pro-competition interventions. And what's the difference? So basically, would it be correct to say that the Chapter 3 is about fairness, Chapter 4 is about contestability. Why do we have two parallel, not very symmetric mechanisms? What is the reason behind it? And do you think it's what the CMA would prefer to have, or maybe there is a way to harmonize them, or they were done separately on purpose? Can you explain a little bit the logic of these two pathways?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. The CMA has two sort of distinct tools in this regime. There are the conduct requirements and there are the pro-competitive interventions, and clearly there are also the sort of merger reporting requirements. But to focus on the conduct requirements and the pro-competitive interventions, I think the first thing to say is that I don't think the difference for those tools is the objective they seek to achieve. So I don't think that conduct requirements are purely about fairness, and I don't think that pro-competition interventions are purely about contestability. I certainly see all of those tools under a broad banner of competition and consumer policy, and all the traditional outcomes that you would be seeking to achieve for people, businesses, the economy, giving consumers access to information, informed choice, ability to move around, ensuring businesses can compete and thrive on a level playing field, competitive markets, innovation, productivity. So I see all of the tools of the regime under that broad banner of competition and consumer policy. The reason for the two tools is the conduct requirements. I think we've always described as guardrails intending to steer firm behaviour. So at the most extreme, and I don't think we would ever articulate them like this, sort of do this, don't do that, which is the way the DMA categorised them. But essentially they are trying to steer firm behaviour. And I think they are, to my mind, a sort of more ex ante focused tool, in the sense that they're not only intended to correct for behaviour that's already taking place, so existing conduct, but they're also meant to be preventative. So looking ahead, if the firm wants to introduce a new product or a new design feature, they can look at this set of conduct and think, well, we would need to be able to develop that or make those decisions in line with these rules. So they are about guiding firm behaviour. Whereas the pro-competitive interventions are intended to be interventions which are more about addressing a particular market feature or behaviour, which is sort of the reasoning why the firm has its position of power in the first place. So that could be, for example, network effects or access to data, or a kind of particular market feature that has sort of led the firm to have that SMS status. So they're both grounded in competition and consumer policy, but one is about kind of guardrails on conduct, and the other one is intended to be about addressing particular market features, a little bit more in the kind of CMA market study, market investigation approach.
Peter, private enforcement is a big issue. We remember time when the very mechanism was very actively promoted by public authorities, looking at other jurisdictions where the proportion of cases brought by private parties is much higher, the critical mass of them. But there are more and more voices these days saying that it could be, it could go too far, particularly with third-party funded litigation and many other or some other mechanisms. Do you think what would be the role of private enforcement in the DMCC?
Well, there's an awful lot of existing private litigation in the big tech field. I looked through it before coming on air. There are 40 current collective actions. There are 3 or 4 big business-to-business actions. I mean, there's a great appetite for litigation, but in contrast to the discussion we were having earlier, this is litigation against big tech companies by the under consumers or undertakings who feel that they've suffered harm. So it's a different animal. And as I read the provisions of the bill, I think the intention is that the CMA DMU should be given a sort of helping hand. In other words, if they make impose a relevant requirement, I think it's just a technical term, and it's not complied with, then obviously, of course, the CMA can take enforcement action, but that's a bit of a distraction. But a party affected can apply to the courts or to the CAT on the basis of that breach. So it's a breach of statutory duty by the undertaking for not complying with whatever the CMA has told it to do by whatever means. So it's an aid to the system. It's not really meant to distract from it. It's meant to enforce it. Can the CAT handle it? Will there be too many cases? I think the CAT will manage. It's never been an issue. Infinitely expandable. My only comment would be it looks a bit slightly unambitious. I mean, to limit the role of private enforcement simply to helping the CMA enforce its orders probably won't be how it will remain, because that's how competition private litigation started under the Competition Act, and as you rightly say, it's mushroomed into a sort of whole animal all of its own. But it's there already. I mean, not under the DMU, but under Chapter 1, Chapter 2, there are big private actions already, and that will be the pressure, I think.
Tom, what do you think in terms of private enforcement? Because there are voices who say that it's a little bit similar to the negative effect of leniency, where when we talk about regulatory dialogue, you need exclusivity, because otherwise the dialogue is meaningless, and the promises to turn a blind eye to some practices if you comply without circumventing with other strategically more important pro-competition vision, so to say, would be less reliable, because there is so very long queue of private litigants who are waiting for, and thus undermining the merits of regulatory dialogue, and the fruits are designed to hang so low for speeding up selective discretionary enforcement by the CMA, rather than just granting endless opportunities for private parties. Where would you position your vision in this spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't have really strong views on this topic, and I certainly don't have any personal sort of experience of being exposed to this world. I think my view really is, in an ideal world, the CMA would be sort of adequately resourced to run the regime in such a way that no one felt the need to take forward sort of private cases. I think I would like to be in the perfect world where the CMA sort of is enforcing and actively, and sort of market participants and individuals sort of feel that things are working well, and therefore it's not needed. That might not necessarily be entirely realistic, but I think that's the dream I would sort of like to work towards.
Catherine, what is your view? Do you think it's purely hypothetical scaremongering scenario where the existence of very abundant private enforcement mechanism would somehow also compromise on the reliability and the power or bargaining chip within this regulatory dialogue?
So, I mean, I tend to think about private actions as being complementary to the sort of public enforcement focus of the regime, which will be sort of public enforcement by the CMA. And I think sort of one of the sort of key focuses of private action is quite often redress, and parties seeking to access redress. And I think, yeah, as I say, that's quite complementary to the CMA trying to effect behavioural change through its enforcement. So I see the two as quite complementary. I think the challenge for the CMA is clearly in the early years of the regime, where the regime is still bedding in, and we're trying to ensure that there's sort of a coherent approach, just needing to ensure that private action doesn't undermine that. So I think that would be, that would be the thing that we'd be watching in the early years of the regime. But as I say, I think our view is that the two are sort of quite complementary.
I mean, that's why I've made the point, Oles, that this is not a parallel regime. This is not, you can't ground a private action on the basis of the provisions in the bill that the act, as it will be, that the DMU is enforcing. The DMU has to take action. So it's quite clear that's where the focus is.
So it's a follow-on.
My
It's not
point was that
standalone.
that there's also a lot of litigation under the general competition law covering some of the same subject matter. That's the point to bear in mind. There's a big appetite for private
And this
litigation.
leads me perfectly to the question which I wanted to ask you, one of the concluding one, Peter. Namely, we know that the DMA, again, positions itself, and the Commission was very active trying to emphasize it continuously as a new start. It's not about competition. It's about contestability and fairness. It's different. It has been adopted under 114, market integration. The DMCC is a continuation. In a sense, does it matter that much that you could somehow develop your case based on the previous cases verbatim pretty much, rather than trying to extrapolate it more symbolically, or it's rather less significant and it's more academic discussion, while we all understand that it's all about competition sensu lato, so to say?
Sensu lato, yeah, I mean, competition is very broad, but this is a very specific regime with specific objectives, which the government has set out. And I think it will be judged on its merits. I don't think it'll be somehow subsumed into wider competition. I mean, as you know, there's a lot of discussion as to whether traditional competition law covers some of these practices and situations. And rather than torture competition law into solving it, the government has taken the view, not the only government, that something specific is needed. So I think we need to give the specific regime a chance to work before saying, oh, well, it's really just part of competition, they should have carried on with the old powers. I mean, I think it's a very targeted and specific regime, and I'm watching it with great interest.
And the issues of non bis in idem, for example, would not be relevant directly.
Well, you know, you can try anything, and the competition regime exists already, and the private action regime in competition exists already. That's a given. But it may, depending on how well this is done, this may take over.
I'm mindful of time, and I think we had really vivid, colorful conversation with different views being presented. Before reverting to the issue with which we close our conversation, namely recommendation to newcomers, students who will be your counterparts very soon, your peers. I wanted to ask if anybody wanted to add any specific issue which has not been addressed in the context of the DMCC. No, okay.
Well, let me just say, just repeat what I said at the beginning. The standard of review debate is fascinating, highly technical, but I think in the end it's a distraction from the essence of this debate, which is how to set up an effective regulatory regime.
But did anybody see? We know the letter. We see. We hear the word rumors. It's only at the level of some. We don't see the text. How precisely the bill is proposed to be amended yet.
I know nothing about that. Genuinely.
We keep silent.
If I did know, I wouldn't tell you, LS. I actually don't know.
Okay, I'll turn the recording off. Okay, we are approaching the end of our conversation, and let me ask you to share your views and recommendations with students. Maybe we can start with you, Catherine. What would be your recommendation? You participate in this very vibrant digital markets unit, and you expand and you recruit, and you are embarking into such remarkable decades of enforcing DMCC or observing and creating competition in digital markets. What would be your recommendation? What would your vision of ideal candidate maybe?
Ideal candidate to come and work in the CMA? Well, firstly, I'd say the CMA is a great place to work, so do please come and join us. I think you've done the sales pitch for me. Fascinating work, get under the bonnet of digital markets, understand what's going on in these firms, think about the problems, what regulation is needed. Absolutely fantastic place to start your career, learn, build, and you can go on and have a career in regulation, or you can go and do what Tom's done and go and work for a startup, but brilliant place to work. In terms of ideal candidate, I mean, I would say there is no ideal candidate, and I think quite often there is quite a lot of I don't know, there's sort of an expectation that if you go and work at the CMA, you have to be an economist or a lawyer, and I would absolutely dispel that myth. You know, I think if you are interested and engaged in digital markets, then we have got all types of, we've got history PhDs, geography students, you know, we have got all manner of people, career change returners. I think good judgment, you know, ability to communicate, ability to work as a team. Yeah, come and join us if you're interested.
Many thanks, Catherine. Tom.
Yeah, a really broad question. I sort of interpreted it in a couple of ways. I guess a student academic thinking about where to think and what to think about and what sort of research to sort of do. I think we're just scratching the surface on the types of issues and markets that the new regime might over the long term relate to. So I'd encourage students to think about 5-10 years down the line, what other markets might tip, what other markets have the characteristics that could end up being dominated by some of these firms. Is it sort of cars, or where else might the sort of big tech companies manage to sort of bring in within their ecosystems? And think about that. Think about what the implications of that might be. I think that's a really interesting and perhaps under-researched area. I think the other thought I had was for students thinking about where they're going to go and what they're going to do. Absolutely endorse what Kat said about going to the CMA. It's an absolutely fantastic place to work. The other thing I would say is just think about what you care about, what you're passionate about, and what your values are, and don't be afraid to go out there and try and create roles for yourself by speaking to people and sort of really sort of showing off your passion. You don't always need to apply for jobs on a job board.
Thank you, Tom. Peter.
Well, slightly going against what the others have said, I would say that my main advice to students is don't believe anything anybody tells you. And I mean, the one benefit of the legal training is it teaches you to be thoroughly skeptical about everything anybody's saying, because it's usually not right, or there's some other aspect to it. I mean, what we've been discussing is a really important subject. There is, in a sense, there's a war on. I mean, this is a major change. It's a fourth industrial revolution, or whatever you call it. And getting a regulatory system right is incredibly difficult. And it takes, as Catherine says, people from all disciplines. You need to have a certain modicum of intelligence. And I suspect you need to be reasonably tech savvy. Otherwise, you're going to be blinking at everything that happens. But in circumstances where every new invention appears to bring countless benefits, but you know there's a hidden cost to it, you need to be thoroughly skeptical and interested in the area and enthusiastic. And I agree with Tom, you've got to have some commitment. It's no good just saying, oh, what can this do for me? I think, what can you do for the public good? So go to it. I'm very impressed by the young. They seem far more idealistic than I was. I think that could be captured.
Catherine Batchelor, Tom Fish, Peter Freeman, thank you very much indeed for this lively conversation. It was a pleasure to hosting you today.
Thank you, Alice.
Very much.
Thanks. Right.
Thank you.
Bye to all.